Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the Campfire Chat on large-scale carbon dioxide removal organized by the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative. We have four amazing guests with us who will share their experience in relation to this topic. I will ask them later to introduce themselves, so we'll come back to that. The idea is to have a discussion around the virtual campfire. We are not going to make long speeches. That's not the idea. The idea is to have a good discussion, and then there will be time also for questions from the participants. My name is Janash Pasztor. I'm the Executive Director of the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, C2G. We're a small foundation-funded initiative, and our main mission is to catalyze the creation of effective governance for climate-altering technologies like carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation modification. We're impartial about their use or non-use of these technologies. One part of our strategy is to encourage learning through exchange of experience, through conversations like the one we're going to have today. And as part of that, we have put together a whole series of these events. We call them C2GLearn and C2G Discuss, where we've brought together, altogether 50 experts from the world, from different cultural, scientific, technical, and other backgrounds to discuss these issues. The purpose of today's event is to show that there are different views. There's a diversity of views on these issues. Because by having different views expressed by the invited guests, we get a sense not just of what those issues are, but why they have those views. And the objective is not to come to conclusion between these different views or to convince the others. The objective is really to understand that there are different views and why our guests may have different views. Let's hope that our guests will be able to help us in that. And also when you think about questions later, you think about that, not just to ask a question, well, why? Now, of course, the views expressed here are those of our guests, and the questions are, of course, those of the participants. Those are not our views at C2G, but we do think that these kinds of conversations are important contributions to overall governance. Now, just a few words about the topic, but I'll let our guests talk more about that. We know pretty much that from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but also from other sources, that the world will need large-scale carbon dioxide removal. How much, when, which technology, which approaches, those are all part of the governance debate that needs to be had. And some of these are big questions. What is their role? What amount they can do? What are the benefits? What are the risks? And then how to manage between to maximize the benefits and minimize the trade-offs and the risks. Those point the need to discussions about and then eventually good governance about those issues. So we hope that our discussion will be able to contribute to that. Very briefly, on the mechanics of this event, after a brief introductory statement by each participant, about 4 minutes each, we hope to have a discussion between the guests themselves, and I will try to facilitate that. And then in the meantime, I very much encourage the participants to start voting, to start putting questions, and then the questions can be voted upon by the participants, and the higher the votes the question gets, the more likely it will be addressed. Of course, we'll do our best to address as many questions as possible, but usually with the limitations of time, that is not possible. So with that, I would now like to turn to our guests, and I would like to start with Sabine Fuss. Please go ahead, and we look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Janash. My name is Sabine Fuss, and I lead a working group at the Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change. And I'm also holding a professorship on Sustainable Resource Management and Global Change at Humboldt University of Berlin. Furthermore, I have been a lead author of the special report on 1.5 degrees global warming of the IPCC that Janash just mentioned briefly. In this case, with a particular focus on the possibilities for removing CO2 that we already emitted back from the atmosphere. That's why I have formed a little bit of a bird's eye view of the topic, and in contrast to technology experts, I am convinced that it will not be a single technology which will enable us to withdraw gigatons worth of CO2 from the atmosphere, but I rather believe in a portfolio of approaches, and I'll get to explain that in the next 2 minutes. So how do we remove CO2? There's a vast array of technologies and practices out there, and for the sake of saving time, let me put them in two different categories. The first one I call, for the sake of simplicity, land-based, so including practices which are rather well known, like afforestation, where newly grown trees sequester CO2 from the atmosphere, but also technologies that, for instance, grow additional biomass for bioenergy, where the biomass sequesters CO2, and when we transform the biomass into bioenergy, we don't let it escape, but we capture it and store it underground. So a clear governance challenge that emerges from these land-based techniques is related to the additional amount of land needed. So as Mark Twain said, buy land, they're not making it anymore. So land really is a scarce resource. We have to be very aware of this. And we might want to use this resource for other purposes, such as feeding a growing population, safeguarding our terrestrial biodiversity, and so on. So governance schemes will be needed to ensure sustainable scale-up and minimize conflicts with other policy goals, especially since many land-based practices come with additional governance challenges because they saturate, they can quickly be reversed, for instance, due to ongoing climate change, if we think about what we heard in the media about wildfires, but also a regime change can endanger natural carbon sinks, if we look at Brazil, for instance. You'll hear more about the relation with nature-based approaches from Stephan in a moment, so let me move on to the other category. Next to land-based approaches, CO2 can also be removed from the air directly by means of chemical processes, for example, through ebb or adsorption, which is called direct air capture, or by accelerating natural processes like weathering of minerals. This might sound like there will be less governance challenges, but one has to note that these approaches are still very energy intensive and therefore expensive, especially in times of economic hardship as we're undergoing right now. It is therefore difficult to imagine how such infrastructures would be scaled up very rapidly. So the governance challenges that arise in this context are obviously related to innovation processes, policies to incentivize deployment, institutions for regulation, accounting, but also monitoring. So to sum up, all approaches I myself have been assessing so far have their pros and cons, and that is what influenced my perspective that there is no silver bullet, but rather a portfolio of bullets, if you want. If we want to reach 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees, and if we want to do so sustainably. Importantly, and that's my final point, the chosen pathway, both how much CO2 we want to remove and also with which techniques we want to achieve this, will be a societal choice, a choice that we as a society have to make. So good governance will also be needed to enable the necessary deliberation processes. And with this, I want to close.
Thank you very much, Sabine. And I go straight on to Duncan, please.
Thanks very much, Janos, and thanks so much for hosting this important event. My name's Duncan McLaren. I now work at the Lancaster Environment Centre at Lancaster University, but I came lately to academia, where I'm a research fellow and professor in practice, following quite a long career with environmental campaigning organisations. The thread that has linked my work now with my work in the environment movement is justice, and hopefully everyone on the call understands that climate change is a huge issue of justice and injustice, that it's unfair to future people and unfair particularly to people in the global south as a result of the the distribution of the causes and the impacts of climate change. In that context, my biggest worry about carbon dioxide removal is that it is in many ways just one more future promise of action about climate change. And we've seen a whole series of promises that we will do things in the future. But while we wait for those promises, we see continued emissions and indeed even accelerating emissions. And if we're going to achieve climate justice, we need to accelerate the reduction in emissions, really quickly mitigate as fast as we possibly could. So the work I've been doing at Lancaster in the last few years has looked particularly at how we might stimulate carbon dioxide removal as an addition, as a way to increase and to accelerate climate action, rather than as an excuse for delay. But when I look around me in the world today, I see big reasons to worry that it is and will be used as an excuse for delay. I'll just give two examples. We can surely talk about more later. But we saw even Donald Trump, skeptic extraordinaire, if you like, embrace the idea of the Trillion Trees initiative. Plant trees, not stop closing coal mines, not stop closing coal-fired power stations, seems to be the Republican American approach to climate change at the moment. It's clearly an effort to justify their failure to cut emissions enough. And in this case, the carbon benefits of huge amounts of tree planting are, I would argue, both uncertain and exaggerated. We can maybe delve into that. A second example is the corporate promises. We're hearing companies all over the world, huge companies like from Microsoft to British Petroleum or BP, saying that they're going to achieve net zero and they're going to do that, or even better, sometimes net negative, but that they're going to do that by using carbon removal techniques, particularly tree planting, but not always, there's others involved. All of these promises, though, are predicated on using carbon removal as an offset for some continued emissions. There's always this basket of, oh yeah, we're going to still be emitting, but we'll offset it. And no one is asking the question of what happens when you add all these different proposals together and compare it with what might be possible with the carbon removal techniques, nor are they asking, are these the best, the fairest allocations for these carbon sinks? I fear what we're seeing is a carbon grab, that these big companies are grabbing the capacity of CDR with these promises into the future. And it will be then a cost to ordinary people, people who perhaps shouldn't be cutting their emissions, poor people, who will bear the brunt of policies driving down emissions cuts.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we need to move on. You've left some very interesting ideas there. Okay, and next I'd like to go to Stephan, please.
Thank you, Janos, and thank you, Sabine and Duncan. I think you have issued a couple of very valuable points. Let me start as a scientist from a fundamental perspective. I work for Climate Action Network International as a climate science advisor, energy policy advisor. So working with the IPCC. So I think I know a little bit about the challenge. The point is, it's not either or. I think we shall not go on that slimy route. We need both. We need deep emissions reductions from the conventional sources speedily, fast, with justice and equity, Duncan. I think we all agree on that one. I think that's our mantra back and forth in CAN International with our colleagues in the South as well, with grassroots and big logos, and we fight for that one. But we cannot just think about leaving it either to CDR to solve the issue or to have deep emissions reductions. That will not let us to address legacy CO2 in the atmosphere, but is necessary to bring us down to 1.5 degree and avoid dangerous climate change and dangerous impacts on nature, on people and communities. So whatever the technologies are for CDR, we as CAN have selected, we can't select that one, we have chosen a choice and said nature-based solutions, choices that are based on removing carbon from the atmosphere via natural solutions. And this is mainly protection of ecosystems, and restoration of ecosystems is the most logical choice. I cannot tell you at this point in time whether this will be enough, but I think that we need to fight for that one to be the first choice, once, second, and third, because we're missing that one. We see still big losses of forests, we see losses of ecosystems, of wetlands and peatlands, and we cannot let this happen. And this also should be avoided, not only because of climate change, but because of huge impacts on ecosystems, on indigenous people's rights, impacts on food security, etc., etc. There are many, many reasons why nature-based solutions, in particular restoration and protection of pristine ecosystems, are very, very important. And they also have a very good benefit for climate change. Now, what distincts those one from the rest of CDR? A couple of things. There are overlapping issues with reforestation and afforestation, and unfortunately reforestation and afforestation with a very narrow definition of the Food and Agricultural Organization of the FAO have been used to lump sum restoration under those. That's not true. This restoration is not about planting trees. Let's be very honest on that one. It's good nature management with people, inclusive and participatory. I think we need to keep that in mind. It's not monocultures. The issue of the other CDR activities, I'm not getting into that one here in detail because I think we can talk about BECCS, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage differently. But for me, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage is not part of a nature-based solution because it involves strongly monoculture plantation, requires lots of land, as we know from the IPCC, and is based on, banked on strong geological savings of CO2. Which might be work, which might be not working. We still do not have the full understanding of the geological permanence of those carbon dioxide storage points if we rely on geological CO2 savings. The reason why we prefer also nature-based solutions, restoration and protection of lands is that since the Industrial Revolution, we have lost, the world has lost between 500 and 600 gigaton CO2 equivalents, more or less, a little bit more or less. And that would help us to bring us down significantly in conjunction with fossil fuel phase out, with 100% renewables by latest 2050, energy efficiency, storage technologies, phasing out HFCs, all this together makes it built. It's not either or. And I think we need to understand this as NGOs, as climate community, that we need to address this first and foremost. Whether other CDR opportunities will emerge over time, in particular mineral reserving, which I personally believe might have an opportunity, but there are energy penalties. We will see. But at this point in time, we would say we focus just on conventional emission reductions and nature-based solutions. It has win-win benefits beyond climate change. It has potentials in the IPCC. Sabine, you had been a key also of the IPCC. You know the scenario sets called capital P1, which showed us that we can do that one based on a scenario. So there's no guarantee, but based on a scenario, it's technological possible to do it all with decarbonization from fossil fuels fully, without reliance on CCS, without reliance on BECCS, but with strong focus on nature-based solutions. Personally, I do believe, and that's an issue we need to talk about, is how do we deal, and that's a personal thing, I cannot talk for CAN for this one, is the issue of permanence, which we need to address in one way or the other. And that's why we need liability as a legal provision, why we need strong biological, strong biodiversity boundaries. When we do restoration, we cannot rely on monocultures. We cannot rely on foreign plantations. We need to rely on local crops, local trees, I should say. to do that and leave the forest recover itself. I think that's also distinctly different from classical afforestation and reforestation. It might take time, but that's what we need to do. And on top of that one, again, I repeat, one issue is protection of existing carbon-rich and biodiverse ecosystems, which will help us, to store significant carbon in existing ecosystems. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephan. Excellent. Lots of other interesting ideas. Viktor, share with us a few thoughts, and then we'll get into the discussion mode.
Hi. First of all, thanks for inviting me to gather around this campfire. And instead of singing folk songs with you all, I would look forward to enjoy a promising chat with everyone, including our audience. I'm Viktor Jósa. I'm European, and I was born in Hungary. I was invited to join this campfire chat to represent the diverse views of the ECOS community, where I serve as a co-focal point. And ECOS stands for Education, Communication, and Outreach Stakeholder Community of the UNFCCC. Today, I aim to bring some of the views of our community to this campfire chat, along with some of my personal takes on the issue of CDR governance. So my perspective roots from the field of education and outreach. Inclusivity and active citizenship are core values in my advocacy, as well as consultancy services. And with CDR governance, I have the concerns that it will take place before participation will be available to key stakeholders. And this is why in our outreach and educational activities, we strive to embed the issue of CDR, as we know that in order to reach our global climate goals, it is key to deploy CDR at a large scale, as well with other necessary measures. And together with C2G, we continuously collaborate in different ways to foster dialogue and understanding, for example, among young individuals. And we have done this through interactive simulation games, role-playing games, where participants can try and see the climate impacts and temperature scenarios of CDR approaches. And we experienced that our participants were skeptic about carbon dioxide removal, just as many of you just elaborated on these issues. As our participants, they knew it from early approaches of CCS and CCUS, mainly deployed by the fossil fuel industry. And fortunately, we also experienced that through interactive role play, through the En-ROAD simulator that we used, and creative content, such as C2G's user-friendly infographics, we can provide people those tools that will broaden people's perspectives on the vast opportunities and risks of CDR. And CDR approaches in their current state are way too abstract. And I believe that citizens, future generations, but policymakers as well, need to be continuously engaged in the governance discussion through storytelling, creative content, and open dialogue. So here we are in an open dialogue, and let's make sure that by acting as experts of this subject, we don't exclude people who are not in the heat of this campfire chat. Thanks.
Thank you. And indeed, Viktor, there are many, well, we don't know how many, we know how many participants we have. We don't know what kind of backgrounds they come from, but we do the best we can to invite experts from different backgrounds and different geographical and other locations. And while in total for our C2GLearn, C2G Discuss, I think we're doing okay. Sometimes individual events may not necessarily turn out as broad participation of speakers as we would like to see. Anyway, excellent ideas on the table. What I would like to suggest now, as I listen to you, I certainly picked up a couple of interesting points I would like to ask you, but maybe you would like to ask each other something just to follow up, to better understand what one of you or the other of you have said. So first, I'd like to leave the opportunity for the guests to ask questions from each other. Yes, Duncan?
I'll begin by responding to something Stephan said, and perhaps ask everyone in response to this. So Stephan said, we all know it's not either or. And that is 100% true of this group of people gathered in this call. But I don't think it's very true at all of the political and corporate interests who wield most power in the world today. And I'd like to know whether my fellow presenters and other participants share that view, or if they have trust that the key decision makers understand now that it's not either or and will act on that understanding. Because that is then a separate greater challenge if your interests are in extracting as much fossil fuel as possible, for example.
Okay, anybody would like to respond to that from the guests? Have a thought on that? Yes, Stephan. And please don't mute yourself. Just leave your mic on. It's easier to jump back into the discussion there.
Yeah, thank you, Duncan. I think we agree on that one. I think there's a dispute. We are not naive. We know that this is being misused. And we think that it's very important that we make sure that fossil fuel companies are not using net zero or not negative emissions to basically disguise, hide, or keep on emitting their CO2 even from scope 3. But we cannot control that one, right? The only thing which I'm very concerned about is, in top of that, my plea for nature-based solutions or natural-based solutions, restoration, protection is that those fossil fuel companies, and we talked about this before, Duncan, in the preparation of this call, is that fossil fuel companies, namely the big oil and gas companies, put increasingly protection of tropical forests, et cetera, on their agenda for basically compensating for and offsetting the fossil fuel emissions, which I think is illegitimate. It's completely unacceptable. But this is a political fight. As long as we have the fungibility, CO2 is CO2, a ton is a ton is a ton. That will be unfortunately possible. I think politically, we have to fight for that. We have different firewalls between different ways of mitigation for clarity, for transparency. I'm not talking for ambition, it's a different story. We cannot mix up all the different ways of mitigation, all the gases, without having clarity, who is doing what in which sectors. That will provide transparency and clarity and will help us to address all these issues in a much more scientific and politically sound way.
Thank you.
And I
Sabine,
also add something to what Stephan was just saying, because one sentence sort of stuck in my mind, which said, like, we cannot control this, right? And I think to some extent, as scientists, we also do have the responsibility, because we do provide framings and we do communicate our results. So we do have some responsibility for doing this right, or at least, I'm not saying we're doing it right yet, but at least trying to do better. I mean, communication itself is a whole science in itself, and I think there is a lot of scope for improving, including my own communication.
Sabine, when I said we, I talked for NGOs.
Okay, excellent.
Okay.
Well, I'm not saying scientists can control anything, but at least we can try.
Maybe I can just jump in here. Something, Sabine, you said early on, and this may link to this. You said at the beginning that these are societal choices. And I want to ask you a very provocative question. Why not the scientists make these decisions, these choices? Why shouldn't they be the ones, since they have the answers? They know what are the issues.
Well, but it's for society to decide what they can accept and not, right? I mean, 1.5 degrees is also a decision that comes from not accepting the impacts that exceed 1.5 degrees, right? It's not that the world stops if we exceed 1.5 degrees global warming, right? Especially with the warming being an average. But if we don't want to accept that part of our society is affected by these incremental impacts, then we have to act accordingly. And if you think this a little bit further, that also links up very nicely with what Stephan was saying earlier, right? He said, oh, but there is this, in the latest IPCC report, there is this one pathway where we do a lot on the demand side. We really drive emissions down in the short run, also through behavioral change and so on. And as a result, we need less CDR, we need less negative emissions, and we can actually cope with nature-based solutions, right? So that's a choice, right? So, and if we want to be on that pathway, then we have to act accordingly. But it's not something that scientists can prescribe. Scientists have to evaluate all the different risks that come with the different pathways, and if the risks of pathways that get used more CDR are unacceptable to society, then we should definitely avoid them. And that's also what you saw in the IPCC process around the special report, right? Many nations said, okay, a pathway with a lot of overshoot is not what we perceive as a 1.5 degree pathway. As a result, you see these green pathways in the final graphic that do not have a lot of overshoot, and the gray ones that have a lot of overshoot, and then a lot of CDR to come down to 1.5 degrees.
Okay. Thank you. I think that, Duncan, you have, so, and then
Yeah.
Viktor. And while you're thinking about your response, just to remind our participants that please put your questions up. I see them, they're coming in very nicely. We'll come to that in a few minutes. Duncan, and then Viktor.
I think to build on what Sabine has just said, clearly those desirable pathways that involve behavior change and so on are going to involve people choosing to live lives differently. And we can't, well, we could try to impose that on them, but the last huge experiment in that vein went very badly wrong in the Soviet Union. So perhaps we need to bring them along in a more democratic manner. I think this gets though to the nexus of the challenge we found in our research at Lancaster, which was that when we got people in the room talking about these problems, we could see that there was a tension in their lives between the benefits they got from living in the expanding economy, growing emissions, whatever situation, and their scientific or analytical understanding that this had to change. And I believe deeply that what we are seeing is a sort of unexplored desire for an easier pathway, a pathway that allows us to go on living lives of relative luxury here in the rich north, while in developing these technological and land-based ways of taking more and more carbon, and never mind talking about the possibility of using solar geoengineering as well, which the same mindset will take you to. And I think we need to unpack that and try and be more honest about what it is that we like about our current lives, but also understanding why that is so unfair and unjust. And that brings me back to this point. The reason scientists shouldn't be asked to make these decisions is that it wouldn't be just, it wouldn't be fair. Justice demands that people get to make the decisions that change the lives that affect them. And Viktor has talked already about the importance of participation, and I couldn't endorse that more strongly in both how we decide on these things, but also on how we do them, how we deliver them.
Viktor?
Reacting to this, in an ideal world, scientists and science would warn the world, warn the broader community about the risks, the issues, and the opportunities, to where the community, the people, the citizens would react to saying, yes, we would like this change, or no, we would not like this change, or yes, we stand up for this cause. And that's the point where the regulatory framework can come in and the policymakers can come in and actually start working out, implementing the response. And that's again the point where science comes in again, where this regulatory framework, this implementation is underpinned by scientific findings. But if any of these stakeholders is not present enough, this ideal world doesn't exist anymore. So that's why I'd like to highlight again the diversification of the actors involved.
And of course, we don't live in a very perfect world, neither a very just world. And we talked earlier about oil and gas companies, and they wield enormous power, and therefore they take a lot of space in these discussions, whether it's through their technological work and potentially also finding solutions, but also potentially finding solutions that benefit them and maybe not the others. So, you know, the question I was going to ask at some point is that to what extent can we trust these major companies, fossil fuel companies, in order to help the long-term solutions from your different perspectives? Stephan.
Yeah, you wouldn't be surprised about my response here, right?
Well, it depends how you say it, Stephan, right?
We would not trust them. We would not trust them because we have seen that they have been taking us for a ride for 50 years on many issues. I don't have to repeat all those things. I think many of you would agree on that one. And they have been benefiting from an atmosphere, from a political, economic, societal atmosphere that had helped to grow their business model based on fossil fuels and new explorations. Every day we invest, not we, but they invest about, not every day, every year, about $1 trillion per year for in energy, in the current energy, it's fossil fuel pathway. And this is a climate crime. Let me be very honest on that one. This is a climate crime, what they are doing, and they know for many years what they are doing. But it brings them profits, shareholder profits. The point is that we as society and we as responsible citizen need to make sure that they don't get away with misusing tropical forest protection, nature-based solution, using the right vocabulary, the right jargon, to still keep their own business model growing while increasing atmospheric CO2 concentration, was not addressing the key issue is leaving the stuff in the ground, right? And I think we need to be very honest on that one towards those companies and call them what they are. They're cheating the climate in a big way.
Okay. Any other reactions?
I will have a different question.
Yeah,
if you
okay,
allow.
go on. Please do.
which follows up from Duncan, and specifically after the 1.5 degree report, I had the feeling we caught up a little of momentum. Countries were coming out with their own net zero legislation, and it was clear emissions had to go to zero. But picking up on your justice argument, Duncan, I was wondering what you think. I spent some time in Sweden last year, and everybody was talking also about their net zero goal, but in fact, they want to go net negative. Does that open then, I mean, we've been talking a lot about justice in the context now of companies and people and in between generations, but on a country level, does that open the whole debate about burden sharing and, oh, developed countries should actually go net negative and it would be just to let developing countries continue with their emissions for a while? Do you see that as a danger?
I think I see that as a potential benefit of the debate about carbon removal, because I would agree that justice would suggest that countries, particularly like my own, the United Kingdom, should be going to net negative. So one of the papers we published recently was called Beyond Net Zero, which is how do we make sure that for rich countries, net zero is just a staging point. And the crux I think in terms of governance is, Stephan said it, being absolutely explicit, having some sort of firewall so that we can see how much countries are planning to reduce emissions, how much they're planning to use negative emissions, where those are coming from, whether they're achieving negative emissions by doing nature-based solutions in other countries. That's a difficult question here as well. It's not, I don't think we have answers to these questions, but we need them to be open to political and public interrogation and accountability. Yeah, I would then come around and agree with you a little. I could see leaders in some political settings in the global south using this as an argument, as an excuse. Narendra Modi might well say, oh yeah, well now that the rich world can go net negative, India can grow its emissions for longer. That may or may not be technically or ethically the right stance. But we can examine this question of burden sharing and include a dimension that in the long term says that the rich world needs to fund and deliver these negative emissions, so that we sorry, there's one other thing about this, which is the question of how much can we do with these technologies. This is what really worries me when big corporations say we can offset our fossil emissions today with these negative emissions by rebuilding the world's forests or the world's soils. But there's probably a limit to how much we can achieve with the world's forests and the world's soils. And we're going to need to use that for this justice-based purpose of taking carbon back out of the atmosphere. So we shouldn't be using it to allow fossil fuel companies, airlines, whatever, to go on profiting today.
Just to clarify briefly, I didn't just mean the global south, but even in the EU, I could imagine some debate.
Oh.
But yeah.
Okay.
One point, Duncan, if I may say so, Janos, one short point. Duncan, it's not only about the carbon limits, how much land you would need for that one, there's a limit to it. I fully agree on that one, which land is not there for that one. It's the ownership. It's the ownership. Yeah. How can international companies dare to say we're going to offset about 400 million tons of CO2 like Shell is doing, and even not owing the land? Indigenous people living on that one, communities living on that one, this is not their stuff. Yeah. This is not their land, right? I mean, this is a kind of aggression towards indigenous, but also other people's communities' land, biodiversity and other things, which I think we need to address beyond, in addition to the climate change issue, if we address offsets.
Okay, very good. A very quick one from Viktor, and then I would like to go to the questions from the participants, because there's quite a lot.
Just reacting to Duncan's point, rich countries driving this, or rich countries supporting this change. I brought up this question, diversification of actors, in Brussels during several discussions with, for example, EU Commission representatives. And the reaction was, we are very happy to open up this conversation to more actors. But the truth is, the fossil fuel industry, who are also actors, especially in spaces like the EU, they are, the answer was, they are best placed to do so because they already have the infrastructure and they have the means to drive this change. And they were referring to hydrogen actors, for example. So when we say diversification, we really have to count with that diversification will mean even more of these actors.
Thank you, Viktor. And I think we might have to come back and have another campfire discussion on the role of the private sector, including some of the actors we've mentioned here. But I would now like to come to the questions from the participants, because there are quite many. Thank you very much. And one of them links a little bit to the discussion we had before, but a set of questions would like to know a little bit more of what would be the political feasibility of having different goals for mitigation and separate goals for removals. How would that look like? And so if you have any thoughts on that, and
so I can probably start on that.
Okay, Duncan, go ahead, and then I'll come to some other questions in a moment.
We published a piece on this in Frontiers in Climate last year, and it's not a perfect model, but the UK's model of how the Climate Change Committee helps set targets in the UK is a good example. There's although they have set a net zero target, there is a very explicit documentation and of how much of this is to be achieved by reducing emissions, which is about 90%, and how much of it is to be achieved in the end by residual emissions being offset by carbon removal, and that's about 10%. And that's backed up with studies on how much they think the removal sector can work, and being very explicit about that being targeted within the UK territorial boundaries. So we're not getting into an issue of importing carbon offsets in effect. Plus, the system sets 5 yearly budgets of net emissions, so that there's also a breakdown over time of how those curves are going. So it's not perfect. There's not the sort of accountability measures or liability measures that might also be needed, but it's a good example of how even a quite neoliberal governance setting can start to take in the idea of separate or at least distinctive targets.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Then a couple of questions relating to partly permanence, but Stephan, you raised in one of your points the difficulty of geological storage, and a number of questions are how important is this? How unanimous are the concerns that you have expressed about geological storage? And then how can one make nature-based solutions, which you all agree that they have so many advantages, but the issue of permanence comes up there, of course, in particular. So how does one work with these? Anybody would like to have a go at that? Okay, Stephan, and then Sabine.
On the issue of geological permanence, one would assume that, of course, carbon dioxide stored geologically is more safe, so to speak, or less exposed to decomposition than biological carbon storage. But the fact is that we have about 25 years of history of CCS generally, and we have about 25-30 million tons of CO2 stored in geological formations. That's 0.015% of all CO2 emissions. Despite the power of the industry behind that one, the oil and gas and coal industry, which had lots of money to do that, they never did it because it was economically not doable. It was too uneconomic, right? And on top of that one, we have seen that many of the geological formations had not been confirmed to be available for long-term storage. There's one big field we have worldwide, I think, which is so far most research and so far most reliable. That's the Sleipner field in the North Sea. Do we all rely worldwide on this Sleipner field in the North Sea, which was meant for capturing about 50 to 100 million tons of CO2, where we see proposals by storing about 1 to 2 gigaton, if not more, per year? Do we all rely on the Sleipner field? I just have my doubts. Third point is liability. If we go to geological storage, then we need legal liability. I have not seen a single contract on liability. The EOR, the enhanced oil recovery storage, so to speak, in the US and Canada is a joke. Even the International Energy Agency does not consider them long-term permanent. So liability is an issue. Once you put the stuff in there, you need to make sure that once the stuff leaks, you have to pay your due bill. I've seen no contract yet by anyone. At least I've seen no proposal by those who promote geological storage to make that contract, right? So before we go into that kind of adventure, we need to get our calculations right, because what we are doing currently with this proposal is to basically sweeping the dirt under the carpet, unfortunately.
Thank you. Sabine?
Yes, so maybe bringing in from what we assessed in the IPCC. So what we were learning from geologists was that in principle, there should be enough geological storage available as a potential. However, one of the problems is, of course, making it accessible in a very short time, and the time window, and this is closing as well. And when I was speaking about Sweden before, and they actually are looking into withdrawing CO2 from the atmosphere, I was actually asking them where they would store it. And in principle, they would have a geological storage there, but to make it accessible would take way too long. So that's why they actually link up with the Northern Lights project by the Norwegians, which yes, they have experience from Sleipner, but they're now investing in significant overcapacities in order to store also CO2 from other countries. Then again, you have to do the accounting. If they would transport it by ship, the balance would still be net negative, but you see how these implementation challenges step by step, of course, erode the negativity, so to say, of the balance that you could have. So yes, if we compare ourselves against the scenarios that we see in IPCC, we're way behind of actually getting there and making it safe.
Okay, I would like to move on to another question, actually related questions that have been posed. One person said that it would be nice to start inclusive conversations of different stakeholders about these issues of carbon dioxide removal, but nobody knows much about this topic, so it's very hard to start. So the question is, advice of the panel, of the guests, how to get going with this kind of conversations. And related to this, how do we get away from the fact that up till now, most of the information is really coming out of Northern universities, of which some of us are representative here? What are the views from the South? Do we have that? Or what do we do about it? So, 2 or 3 questions embedded in this.
I'll offer a little thought on the second.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And I'm sorry, this is not an answer, but just an elaboration, I guess. We're seeing a moment where the idea of decolonizing our educational systems, our institutions, is getting higher up the agenda, particularly because of the amazing work of protesters in the US under the Black Lives Matter banner. It's stimulating my own institution at Lancaster and many others to think about this. And we do need to do that for this subject too. It struck me earlier when we were talking about these scenarios of how much CDR would be used, at what cost, in comparison to how much mitigation. Those models all come out of a tradition of economics that is, to put it bluntly, colonial in the sense of if we want to decolonize these systems. So yeah, we need to do that. It's not going to be fast. It also, horrible tension that it creates is that we cannot, as the privileged, often white, often male, hands up, put the burden of this work onto the underprivileged, the victims, the women, the people of color, and ask them to tell us what to do. We need to hear what they're saying, but not add extra work to those people who are dealing with a lot more problems than we are.
Can I ask both Stephan, Sabine, and Viktor to just reflect on this for a moment, because each of you represent groups that are actually quite broad in their constituencies. How do you look at that within your groups? IPCC, CAN, these are all different groups that represent many, many different people. So how do you look at that? Please, either of you. Sabine.
If I can start, I mean, if you allow me, for CAN International, we have 1,500 organizational members, NGOs, CSOs from across the globe. For us, the voices of the South, the issue of equity and justice are crucial. We have to learn, we have to decolonize. Duncan, is the same for us as well. For us northern blokes, northern male blokes. Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge and it's good. We can learn a lot. We work with grassroots increasingly, and I think that's a permanent pathway we are going. Let me tell you on the inclusion of the South, and let me give you, Janash, a kind of positive example. What you guys have done. You guys have you guys have managed a meeting with Southern NGOs, in particular African and other developing country NGOs. There were a few Northerners involved, including myself, in Nairobi last year on those issues. And I thought this was very, very valuable. And I see Michael Thompson is on the call. Michael was in charge of C2G, and I think many people liked it. It was good to hear the voices from the South. And I'm not getting into my takeaway from that one, but it was very interesting for me to learn how the South sees those issues. And one key issue is that, at least for my constituency, for the NGOs, is for them it's a new issue, right? CDR, SRM, and so on. They're saying, oh my goodness, we can't deal with it because we have so much on our plate. We're working 24/7, so leave us alone with that one, right? I exaggerate a little bit here, right? But that's the issue, underfunding of the Southern civil society, an issue of so many issues they have on daily survival, food security, living, water security, health, and now, of course, the COVID-19 crisis, that they would understandably not focus on those issues. I fully understand that one. Let's be honest on that one. That doesn't mean we stop the discussion with them, but I think it's a broader issue that we always think as groups, wherever we are, in the UNFCCC, in the IPCC, in the science community, in CAN, that we always think about how do we include the Southern folks, the Southern voices, in what we commonly and jointly decide. We're not a couple of shareholders who run the show. What is our common understanding of issues, not just for CDR and SRM. I think that's a cultural change we have to do, which is not only true for CDR and SRM. I see it on many other issues, on carbon trading, on offsets, many other issues. That's still the Northern, if I can talk for my own community, for the CAN NGOs, unfortunately, is still a very Northern-based led and dominated, how shall I say it, community. It changes a lot, but it's still there. And we have to go that way down quite significantly. So if I can talk, just the last point, if I can talk for my senior management in CAN, or the CAN Secretariat, the International CAN Secretariat, 25 people, I can tell you, we have made a change, and I'm in a dire minority. I'm the only male person in the senior management who's coming from the OECD. But it's fun, guys. I tell you, it's fun. The majority, the overwhelming majority is women. We have 20 women against 6 men. And it's fun. It's good. It's really good. It's gives us new perspective. We're all learning a lot. No, I mean it. It's not a joke. I mean it.
Yeah.
Right? So I think we need to learn to jump over our shadows and understand that inclusiveness and participation means also to get fundamentally out of a well-known comfort zone. I was with WWF before, which was a very male-dominated, Northern-based organization, right? I came to a completely different environment, and I love it, I tell you guys. I love it.
Okay, Sabine, please.
So you're asking me to speak sort of on the behalf of the IPCC community, but I have to say that it was a first for me on the special report. And this special report was special in a number of dimensions. So a lot of progress on the gender dimension, more social scientists, regional balance, and so on. So also for the first time, there really was a full chapter dedicated to evaluating the risks for other sustainable development goals and so on. So in that sense, I think there is progress there. Still, we're amongst scientists, right? And this is what the question from the audience was targeting at. But I also sense that modelers are aware of this and that there is increasingly an openness to have more participatory approaches, so that model scenarios don't come first, but second, and that there are more participatory approaches to developing different futures that might be desirable, to borrow Duncan's language from before.
Thank you. Viktor, a few seconds worth of your thoughts.
Yeah, the ECOS community is comprised of also quite diverse actors. I'm talking about youth NGOs, I'm talking about faith-based organizations, but also research institutes. And when it comes to our advocacy and our inclusivity, we are aware that even though participation is often looked as open, our members don't have the same opportunities to engage. So we try to do this in, for example, when it comes to different subjects, we try to compensate that one region or one certain member is good or more involved in a certain subject and others are more involved in other subjects. And we try to use this approach in the ecos community because we can't expect, unfortunately, everyone to be in the same level of engagement.
Thank you, Viktor. And I'm afraid that we have come to the end of this session. We ran out of time. Thank you so much for your thoughts. I hope that this discussion contributed to understanding of different points of view and different ways of going about a very complicated set of issues. So thank you, and look forward to seeing you at the next session. A week from now, there will be a campfire on solar radiation modification. Look forward to seeing you there. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.